Now, what I've just said, is that an extremist statement? Well, let's turn to the Daily Telegraph for some support, because this is what was going on over the weekend. And I can only do the tip of the iceberg here. This is the Telegraph. Here's the headline: Monitoring unit made hourly calls to flag COVID dissent. And if I go on to the next part of the paper, this was a full-page article, effectively. Whitehall is all about control. Information is power. And David Davis starring here, because he discovered that because he'd been putting out tweets questioning the modelling put forward at the start of the pandemic, he'd been picked up by the government's counter-disinformation unit, and they were tracking him and the questions that he was asking. And if you get into this article, you find that actually what we've got is a very pernicious unit which has been created at the heart of government. And this is monitoring anybody who was brave enough to start using any form of social media to challenge any of the government's COVID or lockdown policies. So as you can see, this is a major article, and it's just incredible that it's taken this length of time for the Telegraph to actually get this printed out. So if I take you on a little bit more, well, here we go with a double-page spread. The BBC has a reputation as a truth teller, but in COVID it did what the government wanted. And this is the meat of the article, that this particular unit, I'm going to give you a diagram in a minute to explain this a bit more, but this unit was working alongside the Conservative Party. I'm very sure the Cabinet Office would have been involved, but also the BBC and Ofcom. It was tracking anybody that they considered to be a threat to the government's narrative. And what were they then doing? They were talking to the big, the big internet providers in order to get that dangerous material taken down. So if I bring you on to this particular lady, just to see, well, we're really emphasising how the BBC sees itself. This is Jessica Cecil, who's director of BBC Trusted News Initiative. So the BBC working to spy on anybody who's challenging on one hand, but on the other hand, what's happening here is they regard themselves automatically as trusted news. The hypocrisy is really incredible. And this is a little bit of detailed comment from the Telegraph here. So they're talking about BBC journalists who realised that this control was going on. They couldn't come out and speak about it because of the climate of fear. And it says that journalists who spoke to the editorial team got a response that was patronising and humiliating. And basically the gist of the editorial response was, get back in your box, you can't have an opinion. Now remember, this is the BBC. And if we have a look at another article that appeared in the Sunday Telegraph, this one made me smile, because here apparently the BBC is recruiting to curb liberal bias. So they're going to recruit new staff in order to spread their viewpoints and get rid of liberal bias. But as I put in the top right-hand corner of the screen, the problem with that is the fact that the bias is at the very top of the BBC. It's not, as we can see by the protesting journalists, within the body of the BBC itself. But part of that article, I've used the expression made me smile, but black humour. Let's bring up this and you can see what I saw. A mid-term review of BBC's Royal Charter is examining whether the corporation is sufficiently impartial and the extent to which it's representing audiences from working class backgrounds. And I'll bring the other one in here. John Humphreys, the former Radio 4 presenter, has described an institutional liberal bias of the broadcaster and said that senior BBC figures were devastated by the Leave side victory in the Brexit referendum. What I drew from this is that if you dare criticise the BBC, basically you're going to be put in the extremist bracket, but you're probably also working class. So really, really unpleasant stuff. But let's just have a look at what happens when people ask for information about the BBC itself. And this is a Freedom of Information request, which is asking questions about Verify, BBC Verify. And if we remember, BBC Verify says about itself that it's transparency in action, fact-checking, verifying video, countering disinformation, analysing data and explaining complex stories in the pursuit of truth. This is our promise to consumers. We understand that their trust must be earned, and we will show them that we're doing that each and every day. So the BBC, puffed up in its own importance, somebody sent in a Freedom of Information. Let's have a look at what happened. Well, the answer was that there was no verifying BBC Verify. So in went the Freedom of Information request. And this is what it asked for: a structure chart which names the BBC Verify staff. Please provide a budget for BBC Verify. Please provide the revised information that was used to justify the setting up of Verify. And if we bring in part of the answer, I'll just expand that on screen for you. Basically, the BBC's response is, whoa, we can't answer this question because BBC output or information that supports and is closely associated with these creative activities is held for the purposes of art, journalism or literature, and we don't have to give it to you. So at the end of the day, here we are with BBC Legal. They're simply saying, go away, we don't have to talk to you. And if I just do this very quickly on screen, HM government, of course, at the top, they're spying, they're using propaganda and censorship, but it's in a network. The Conservatives at the belly of the beast, the Cabinet Office, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and the Secret Intelligence Services. But remember that the Conservative Democrats have already said that basically the Conservative Party is not democratic, so we can't trust it. They've also, people in their meetings have alleged that 6 people are in control of the Tories, but that very party has set up this pernicious counter-disinformation unit, and with it is a counter-disinformation policy forum. Who's involved? Well, of course, BBC was involved in it, but also Ofcom. And then if we consider we've now got Marianna Spring setting up fake accounts, and she's censoring and vilifying anybody who's involved in free speech. So remember, BBC monitoring is spying on overseas media and feeding that back to the intelligence services. BBC Media Action is setting up clone media channels. It's also fomenting internal dissent, as it did in Syria, and we're very sure that will be happening in Ukraine. BBC propaganda is pushed into the host country, and it's reframing audiences. And let's not forget 77 Brigade, which has been in the COVID mix. And over on the left of your screen, I'm going to remind people that the very same Conservative Party was using the Behavioural Insights team and behavioural change in order to stop people challenging the government's agenda. So do we trust our government? No. Do we trust the BBC? Certainly not. They're both working together. David, over to you.